Check, 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 check. 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 Okay, Chair. You are now being recorded, and you are ready to start when you are ready.
Testing, testing, testing. Hello, hello. All right, the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission will come to order. It is Wednesday, September 25th at 1:21. Apologize, we're running a few minutes behind, but we will try to catch up as we go. Roll call. Ms. Larson.
Yes. Commissioner Boykin. Commissioner Eaton. Commissioner Gibbs.
Here.
Commissioner Here. Commissioner Hopkins.
Here.
Commissioner Jolon. Here. Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Overturn. Here. Commissioner Ryan. Here. Mr. Chair, you have 9 out of 9 commissioners present.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the City of Thornton for hosting us here in this wonderful rec center. It's great to be here. As many of you know, the COGCC, we've been conducting meetings all throughout the state. At the last meeting, it was in Glenwood Springs, and we had a great turnout, and we're pleased to be in Thornton today. Next up is Executive Director's Office comments and updates, and so that's from me. And so staffing, first of all, for the Department of Natural Resources, we are in the process right now of interviewing for our legislative liaison position, and we're soon going to get kicked off to start interviewing for a policy analyst position. And then next week, we hope to start advertising for our Assistant Director on Climate Change and Energy. So it'll be really wonderful once we have those 3 positions, because it will be critical as we move forward on issues that we're working on with the Department of Natural Resources. We are also finalizing language right now on MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, on shared stewardship agreements with U.S. Forest Service. This is a topic that I've given updates before for some of the folks that have attended these meetings, but what's really exciting about this is this helps put together the framework on how the Department of Natural Resources, the state of Colorado, works with the U.S. Forest Service on everything from trails, on concerns that local communities have, on wildfires, on population growth, on climate change. So we are finalizing this MOU, and we hope to have either the Secretary of Agriculture, Purdue, or Undersecretary Jim Hubbard sign this agreement along with the governor. There is a lot going on in the water world. Last May, there was a bill that passed Congress known as the DCT bill, known as the Drought Contingency Plan, and that passed in May, and that was a 7-state negotiated agreement on planning for less water in the Colorado River for both the upper and lower basin Colorado River states. And even though last winter was a pretty solid year for Colorado and other western states, and Lake Mead saw 20 feet additional water storage capacity, it did not meet the threshold that was required under the DCP agreement. So what that's triggered is that Arizona and Nevada now are implementing mandatory cuts in their water delivery. So this is what we wanted to see with the DCP agreement, where with less water in the Colorado River, we have to adapt, not just Colorado, but other states as well. So again, Arizona and Nevada are working on this cuts cuts to their delivery system. We have a demand management working group that has been conducting meetings all throughout the state. So we have demand management groups that are focused on agriculture issues, on recreation, on economics. There's a local government component as well for that, and they are conducting meetings all over the state of Colorado. Later on tonight and tomorrow, there will be the C9 Summit up in Fraser, and what that is, that's where the Interbasin Contact Committee members will meet with CWCB, a lot of acronyms, I'm sorry, I'll try to let everyone know what I'm talking about, Water Conservation Board members, working together to work towards implementing the Colorado Water Plan. And so all the key players within the IBCC, Interbasin Compact Committee, and Water Conservation Board will be meeting up in Fraser over the next few days. I'll be heading up there tomorrow. Also, at last week's Water Conservation Board meeting in Alamosa, the board approved the technical update to the Colorado Water Plan. This is the first time that the technical update has been updated since 2010. And this is the first time that they're also incorporating climate change in terms of their modeling moving forward. So I'm really excited about that. The Department of Natural Resources, we are really involved and very much responsive on looking at federal actions and processes that come down our pike. So everything from we weigh in on the Uncompahgre Field Office Resource Management Plan to looking at the quarterly lease sales that the BLM proposes, Waters of the U.S. We weighed in on the Eastern Colorado Resource Management Plan just last week. There's the Rio Grande National Forest Plan, and then we also have weighed in on U.S. Forest Service revised NEPA regulations. So a lot of folks may think that Department of Natural Resources is really just kind of a state entity that just looks at only things in the state of Colorado, but we do look at things in Colorado, but we also weigh in on what happens on federal lands, because that impacts what we do for wildlife management and water and other areas too. Let's see here. We developed within Parks and Wildlife a new criteria to look at planning for our next state parks. We've never had criteria in place in the past, and thinking of criteria to develop new state parks. Just a few weeks ago, the governor announced his intention to have Fisher's Peak be our new state park. This will be our 42nd state park in Colorado. This is a 19,200 acre piece of property, which is absolutely just stunning. If any of you have seen Fisher's Peak, which is the 9,600 foot peak that you see from Trinidad, that property encompasses all that property all around that peak. It will be our second largest state park, and when you look at there's a state park just south of this particular area within New Mexico. You include the protected lands of New Mexico State Park and this new Fisher's Peak State Park, and then some of our wildlife areas that we have surrounding this property. We're looking at a contiguous area of 96,000 acres of protected land and 57 square miles. And so this is a big deal for Colorado. It's a big deal for recreational possibilities. It's really a big deal for wildlife. And we are working hard to work with all of our partners, the Nature Conservancy, Trust for Public Lands, GOCO, City of Trinidad, and many others to get this park up and running as soon as possible. So with that, I think that's it for my update. And next we have a report from the director, Director Robbins.
Amy, are we trying to get a PowerPoint up or?
It's not going to be a minute.
Alright, that's fine. I'll just walk through the slides that I had in hand. So Commission, thank you all for being here. Thanks to the public for being here. I hope folks are receptive to the concept that we're still trying to get out and meet and hear from members of the public about the communications that we had in our last meeting in Redwood Springs. You know, we're meeting here in Thornton tomorrow night. We'll have a listening session during the evening hours. in Erie. So we hope that we appreciate you making yourself available to get to various parts of Colorado so that we can hear from all the constituents. In terms of the director's report for things that have occurred over the course of the last month, I have continued with my staff to engage in the various stakeholder processes. I meet monthly with a local government coalition to speak with them about the issues that they are addressing and the things that we're doing at the state. 181 does, I think, provide a new allocation of local government versus state government working together. And so we're meeting monthly with those folks. I met with a local government coalition as Friday as well. I also continue to have monthly meetings with the environmental coalition and hear from them in terms of their early commitment to rulemaking. I meet bi-weekly with industry. We have operator meetings bi-weekly to discuss day-to-day operations. I've been attending those meetings and having discussions. I also, over the course of the last month, met with key elected officials in state government to allow them to have some information about the 181 implementation process that's going on with the state commission. My staff also had community events and outreach over the course of the last month. Staff attended the Erie Oil and Gas Education Fair. Staff also presented to the local Emergency Preparedness Committee convention that was on September 6th. And we had staff and I had toured sites in Wells and Broomfield County. With regard to day-to-day operations and permitting, in early September, we entered into an MOU with Wells County. This establishes a permitting protocol for oil and gas operations located in unincorporated Wells County. Wells County's use of the 1041 land use process provides that we need to look at who
COGCC MOU does. We also provided guidance to operators concerning forms 2 and 2As and how we would be continuing to look at those in unincorporated Weld County as well as across the state. Recently, using my in particular with regard to a particular location, we reopened public comment on the Crestone Acme pad. This pad has received a lot of public comment. It is going to be looked at by my staff and I under 181. Public comment will close on this Friday, the 27th. I would like to allow or inform members of the public that we ask that you provide public comment on Acme through written public comment that is available through our website. We will be taking public comment today on rulemakings, but we're not taking public comment on specific locations. So and I'll make sure that we re-inform folks about that at the 1:30 public comment stage. Commissioner Overturf, I think you have a question?
So I just wanted to ensure that those comments made it from our general hearing bucket and that they got put appropriately in that bucket related to the specific pad.
Excellent point, and we'll make sure that that happens. Again, with regard to day-to-day permitting, I have spoken publicly about the fact that 181 specifically provides that I, as director, am to use objective criteria to walk the fine line of looking at new oil and gas. It was approximately 42 A's in 2017 and 2018. So we're trying to make sure that we get that balance correct in terms of the day-to-day protocol of working under 181. Rulemaking updates, want to inform the commission as well as the public that we launched our online portal. This allows public to provide comments on all of our rulemakings. There's a specific point. You can go to our website and click on 181 and then click on public comment. And then if you want to provide public comment on cumulative impacts, you can do so. You can provide public comment on mission change or on alternative site analysis or flow lines. On a daily basis, my staff is looking at those public comments, ensuring that the public comments are appropriate for being publicized. So if there are comments that have profanities, etc., we don't public those. But for all other comments, and I think it's actually probably 100%, we actually upload those to the website on a daily basis. So for commissioners, if you're interested in seeing what the public is interested in, we're receiving comments daily. Those are publicly posted daily. And so you can go online and see what it is that folks are saying about our various rulemakings. I think this is a really good tool for the public and for us to all try to understand what the stakeholders are thinking about the rulemakings. We also have posted on our website the rulemaking calendar. You can go to the calendar and you can see each month and the activities that are going to happen on each of the rulemakings. It's color coded, so if you wanted to just focus in on cumulative impacts, you'd go to the whatever color code is cumulative impacts, and you can just look at that. Finally, with regard to rulemaking updates, we held our first flow line stakeholder meeting on September 5th. We had 135 attendees, stakeholders from across the spectrum, and we're continuing our outreach on rulemaking and the informal stakeholder groups. Again, rulemaking updates, we're hosting this meeting today. This afternoon, we'll hear from the public here in the North Front Range about the 4 rulemakings. Again, we're having a listening session tomorrow night in Erie. Finally, we've had just on staffing, we continue to hire and allocate internal staffing so that we're best meeting the needs of this large process that is implementation of 181. I've hired 3 new oil and gas location assessment specialists, which basically doubles the team that looks at the 2As. We also hired a senior oil and gas location specialist to come in and help with that permitting group. So basically we've doubled the permitting team that looks at 2As. We are continuing to, we just closed out the second deputy director position, which would be more of a manager position. And I hope to hold interviews later this week for that. And then finally, a throw out to my chief of staff, Julie Murphy. Julie got married this past weekend. So we all want to tell everybody thanks to Julie for that. I understand that Walter was teething that evening. So the awesomeness of getting married came down home pretty quick. So again, thanks, Julie. That's my update. I'll take any questions from commissioners, or we then would move to report from the secretary.
Report from the secretary, Ms. Larson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just 2 items. First, we have prepared a rulemaking handbook for the public. We've been provided a copy of that handbook. It's available on our website. It's designed to help members of the public have a greater understanding of our processes as we move into rulemaking, and provide some references to rules and some references to how to best participate in the rulemaking process. So that is available on our website. We also will be having a hearings and applications handbook that will be hopefully coming out early next week. The handbook will do for hearings what the rulemaking guidebook does, which is provide the public and practitioners some guidance as they are filing applications with the hearings unit and what that process looks like. It does take into account the new 500 series rules, which will go into effect on Monday, September 30th. So the new 500 series rules will be available on our website on Monday the 30th. And again, we should have that handbook up and ready to go early next week as well.
Thanks so much. Any questions? Yeah, Commissioner Eden.
And once the rules go into effect, will the rule document that shows all the rules reflect the changes that were made?
Yes, so
Okay.
our website will be updated. That will show the new 500 series rules, and then there were conforming changes in the 100 series, 200 series,
Right.
and 300 series, if I'm not mistaken. So all that will be live on our website on Monday.
Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner comments? Yeah, Commissioner Ryan.
Thank you, Chairman Gibbs. Good morning, everyone. In addition to being a commissioner on the COGCC, I'm also the executive director of the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. So just wanted to make a comment that in addition to the directives for the COGCC, Senate Bill 181 also requires the Air Quality Control Commission to adopt rules to minimize emissions from the oil and gas industry. And in fact, the Air Quality Control Commission and COGCC will be holding a joint meeting in October, I believe. So our Air Pollution Control Division and Air Quality Control Commission have held several meetings throughout the state to discuss the rulemaking process and listen to feedback from diverse stakeholders. On September 19th, the Air Quality Control Commission held a hearing that kicked off the formal rulemaking process to implement the requirements of Senate Bill 181. The actual rulemaking hearing will be held at CDPHE from December 17th through 19th, and all the important dates and documents, including the proposed rules, can be found on the Air Quality Control Commission's website. At a very high level, the proposed rules will contain new requirements for permitting the transmission sector and a statewide annual emissions report. They'll also enhance existing requirements for storage tanks, leak detection and repair, well site emissions, and pneumonic devices. This rulemaking is also part of CDPHE's larger efforts to combat climate change and come to compliance with federal ozone standards. And we look forward to continuing to engage with our stakeholders throughout the process. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Other comments by commissioners or updates? Yeah, Director Hahn. Or Commissioner Hahn.
Jeff, would this be an appropriate time to discuss my thoughts on the permitting process?
Yeah, actually, we have an hour set aside this afternoon for commissioners to discuss and deliberate issues around 181, so that would be the appropriate time.
Commissioner Mester.
Thank you. I thought I'd just update you all. I chatted last meeting about some of the meetings that I'm having around the state with local government officials. And since the last meeting, I've had the opportunity to travel around the state a bit, meet with some Boulder County commissioners. I've been down to Montezuma County, Dolores County, chatted with some commissioners down there. Had the opportunity to chat with Moffett County and have some upcoming meetings with both Broomfield, Larimer County, Kiowa County, and Los Animas County. So getting some great feedback, certainly making myself available for any questions that they may have about the process, and trying to listen to any concerns that they may have. So it's been a good tour, and it's been good to connect with the different communities around the state. Yeah.
Thank you. It's great to hear. Any other comments? Okay. Seeing none, approval of the minutes. This is from our last meeting, Wednesday, August 21st, and we need a motion for that. Commissioner Boygan moves it, and is there a second? There's a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of approving the minutes, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Seeing none, that carries. Consent agenda items. And are there any folks that need to recuse themselves as well?
Mr. Chair, I will recuse myself from groups A and B, which involve matters for extraction, oil, gas, or affiliates. I am actively adverse to extraction on a matter, and so I'm recusing myself.
Thank you. Any other recusals? Seeing none, is there a motion?
So I'll move approval of the consent agenda. Do you want me to pull those first two first,
Yeah.
with the exception of Group A and Group B as presented?
Is there a second? Motion? Second. Yep. Commissioner Hopkins seconds that motion. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of that motion signify as aye. Aye. Any opposed? Seeing none? Okay. Is there another motion on A and B?
So I'll go ahead and move approval of Group A and Group B on the consent agenda.
Is there a motion? Director Hopkins seconds. Thank you. All those in favor of that motion signify as aye. Aye. Any opposed? Seeing none? That carries as well. All right, thank you. Next up, we have 47 here officer recommendations under Rule 511, but let's see here. We actually have, that was, yeah, exactly. So next we have PUC and PHMSA presentation on pipeline regulation. So Joe Malley, Tom Finch, Julie, actually,
somewhere.
So, Mr. Chair?
yeah, Ms. Larson.
Yes, this is Secretary Larson. So, Mr. Malloy from the PUC and Mr. Finch from DOT, Mr. Finch is here.
Yeah.
I don't see Mr. Malloy yet, so we're.
Oh, he was here.
Oh, he was here. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. So we may need just a minute or two to get set up for this next presentation.
Yeah, I'm just getting into it.
We'll take just a brief break right now as we gather everyone. Thanks.
Yeah.
We're trying to get our PowerPoint, so let me see if we can also get that to the commissioners.
Okay, we'll, especially for Enrique, we'll take a 10-minute break so we can just get everything all set up, and we'll start back up at 10 a.m. Thanks a lot.
I appreciate that. So it won't be so. Okay, awesome. Sweet, thanks, sir.
That's what it felt like, apparently. I mean, I don't know. I was like, and then there's like, I'm excited to meet them. You went anything soon? Okay. So, it's a custody. Right. bucket, but he definitely got here after me, and I got here after him. So definitely was, definitely was. He came in at like about 6:30 or something. Around. You should have seen his face. It looked like Christmas. It was so fun. I'm really excited, obviously. Well, I want to tone it down a little bit. I'm sure Christian was fine a little more. Christian was speaking boy. Well, I mean, he was really nice. I was fine with me. But what he doesn't know is he is actually not person line anymore because Steve Jenkins was kicked out of Keegan's office and he is owed an office. And Sabrina now ranks him as the supervisor. So I'm not going to tell him until it happens. And we're going to be checking in. Hopefully, yeah. He put in a line where I thought it would be, and it wasn't there. Is it on the agenda? No. Because I was going to log on so I would know what's going on out here.
Yeah. I mean, they put it up, and he said he put it up.
Oh, okay.
Let's just go to
That
the
should be like right there, right? Susan Sherman emailed me, and I'm like, it's on the internet. But then I went and looked before I sent that email back. Or I couldn't.
Oh, right here.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Why would there always be a link?
I know. I don't know. I needed a assistant. I need someone to run hearings.
Right. Well.
I don't think they can really, right?
Not in general.
Yeah.
Like, say you're not in prison or yeah, you don't have to do that.
Yeah. It's not.
I mean, I don't know because I haven't seen it.
It's like a production data special.
I really don't. I'm gonna go back to my kitchen. Oh, maybe I'll go make a coffee.
Okay. Thank you.
Testing. Okay, Director and Commissioners, we are ready when you are.
Okay, everyone. It is 10 a.m. We're going to get started on the next item here. So please take a seat. And if you want to continue side conversations, please do those out in the hallway. But we're going to be starting up right now. Okay, so next up, Julie Murphy will give us an update on this next item. And also, so everyone knows, we are up and running on Zoom. Everyone, we're meeting now, so please take a seat and/or. Okay, please take a seat. Okay, thanks so much. Julie Murphy, whenever you're ready, you'll kick off this next part. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. My name is Julie Murphy. I work for Jeff over at COGCC and wanted to take a couple of moments to introduce our next presentation. As many of you know, we're embarking on another flow line rulemaking, and implicit in COGCC's regulations of flow lines, which is our work for the pipelines that we regulate, is the coextensive kind of regulation by two of our other partners, one of them is federal. So we've asked both of those partners to come and talk to our commissioners to help educate them about the landscape, the regulatory landscape for pipelines in Colorado, to better understand what it is that COGCC regulates, what PUC regulates, and what PHMSA regulates. PUC is the Public Utilities Commission, and its pipeline safety program is run by Joe Malloy, who will be our second presenter. And then it is a certified program from the federal PHMSA, the Pipeline Hazardous Safety Materials Administration, which is within the Department of Transportation. And Tom Finch, who's here to my right, will give an overview of what PHMSA does as it relates to pipelines. So after they talk, I'll kind of close up with a brief chat about where we are in flow lines. I think Jeff covered most of it this morning, but be available for questions. And we also have Mark Schlagenhoff, who is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission's flow line integrity engineering program supervisor. So many words. Anyway, so I'll turn it over to Tom. Thanks.
Thank you all for your patience. I'm Tom Finch. I've been with PHMSA since 1999, so almost 20 years. Another year, you might see me retire. I might be old, but I'm slow, so bear with me. I have to look at these too, so. Who is PHMSA, DOT PHMSA? You can see our DOT building, the picture there. I was there a couple weeks ago for a meeting. We're kind of the small part of US DOT. Of course, FAA is so big, they're not even in that building. They've got their own building. We come down to us. We have a hazmat side, and us is Office of Pipeline Safety. So when we were there for a public awareness meeting in June, public awareness and mapping, Elaine Chow walked through, and a couple of the teammates got pictures with her. So, you know, she seemed pretty cordial. She wasn't ready to fight anybody yet. And we have two sides of, I'm blocking you guys, I'm sorry. We have two sides of our.
Can the speaker please move closer to the phone? The audio is not loud enough for us on the phone here.
Okay, can you hear me now? I don't want to blast these other people. Can you hear me? Okay. At any rate, we have policy and programs and field operations. One side is outreach and engagement, standards, engineering and research. State programs is where Colorado PUC falls, enforcement and training and qualification. Our field operations are emergency support, emergency support and security response. And we have regional offices in eastern, southern, central, southwest, western, and Alaska is actually under the western region. So that's kind of how we're broke out. Not close enough to get this working. There you go. There's the map of the 5 different regions. You can see we've got a lot of states to cover that are big states, area-wise, especially Alaska. We have an office in Lakewood, Colorado. That's our Western Region office. We have a satellite office in Ontario, California, and one in Anchorage, Alaska. So that's mainly Western Region. I won't go over the rest of them. Here's our mission: protect people and the environment from the risks inherent in transportation of hazardous materials by pipeline and other modes of transportation. Here's the big principles for us. It is the underlying responsibility of pipeline operators to understand and manage the risks associated with their pipelines. So the pipeline operator has ultimate responsibility. Can't blame it on his contractor. You write them up, it's the operator. Our primary role is to establish minimum, the emphasis is on minimum safety standards defined by required risk and control practices, and ensure that operators perform to these standards at least. Now, states can have more stringent regulations and rules, so most states do. Colorado does for sure. We also strive to impact operator performance beyond mere compliance with the regulations. So, we want them to do better than just the regulations. There's what we're trying to prevent. The upper left is pump station 9 on the TAPS or Alaska line, where their breakout tank, they had a failure to communicate and overfilled the tank. Unfortunately, they had a dike there, but it's still not good. Down on the lower left is Marshall, Michigan. That one was a pretty bad one. Public awareness, it was the landowner that actually alerted the operator that there was a leak. So public awareness is very important. The center one is Bellingham. That happened June 10th, 1999. So that day is designated as Pipeline Safety Day. And unfortunately, 3 young men were killed in that. It happened to be gasoline in the pipeline at the time. It could have been gasoline or other products, but I got to go out here and I retired on, and it wasn't pretty. The upper right, I don't really know where it is, but you could say San Bruno. I've been out there, and that was terrible. 8 people lost their life. Pipeline safety is very important. The one at the bottom right is in West Virginia. There was like 4 lines. This line exploded, you don't say exploded, but caught fire, was supposedly not regulated. It was under what we call 20% of specified minimum yield strength, etc. Well, after this happened, some new regulations came in to make sure it was regulated. Here's what we're responsible for. The safety now of 2.7 million miles of hazardous gas and liquid pipelines. And gas, we always think of natural gas, but you can also have hydrogen and stuff like that. Anything that's a hazardous gas. The liquid pipelines is crude oil and refined products. They carry over 66%. So basically, 2/3 of the energy consumed in the U.S. A lot of it natural gas going to power plants. But we have the safety. This is for our hazmat side. The safety of nearly 1 million hazardous materials shipment daily by all modes, ground, marine, and rail. And they're in Ontario, California, because they inspect at the Port of Long Beach and the city of Los Angeles this port. We're trying to promote the safe, environmentally sensitive, and reliable delivery of energy products that fuel the U.S. economy and transportation system, in addition to the chemicals and other hazardous materials essential to our way of life. So you've read about our hazmat side on the lithium batteries and on airplanes and flights. So we are trying to ensure economic mobility, efficiency, and public confidence. But there are a lot of times there's some pipelines you have to shut down and you're getting pressure the other way. But we need that pipeline. You can't let it operate until it's safe. Okay, the next one, promoting transportation solutions that enhance communities and protect the natural environment. So it's always people and then environment. We want to have effective stakeholder communication with federal and state agencies, pipeline operators, labor industry, response community, and the public, which is all you guys. Here's the latest chart on what all is regulated. Hazardous liquid, I'm not going to read everything to you, but you can kind of see that's 8% of what we regulate. Gas transmission, 11%. Gas gathering, a little less than 1%. But we just had a new rule come in that's going to take 9 months to, we're going to give operators 9 months to implement. So I'm sure that 1% will go the other way. And gas distribution, which you see that's 2.2 million miles. And that's where our state partners come in, such as the Colorado PUC. They basically are responsible for 81%, and a lot of operators. Of course, there's not that many operators in Colorado, but they've got their percentage. So there's your total miles. The liquefied natural gas is really getting to be a big thing. I remember going to meetings with FERC when it was for import LNG. Now it's for export LNG, and there's the number of plants, and I won't tell you much more about that. Underground natural gas storage. How many of you have heard of Aliso Canyon? Yeah, that's what brought this about, and we now regulate 403 facilities. So about 200 of them are state, the other 200 are ours. So I thought I would come on. Okay, it's hard to get this one. Here we go. Let's see. There you go. There's a map of what we've got. You can see where the production areas are. You know, Texas and Oklahoma, Louisiana. They've got a majority of these are transmission pipelines. You know, you might have that little less than 1% gathering. These are transmission oil and gas pipelines. So, just so you know. Okay, we were at the city and county of Broomfield. The map on the next slide was created, you know, from our national pipeline mapping system on our public viewer. Just making you all aware that it's available. You can see the blue is actually natural gas, so it's showing you when you get on our website and on what we call NMPS, National Pipeline Mapping System, or NPMS, you'll be able to get into any county and find out where the oil and gas lines are that are regulated by us. We don't have distribution or gathering. Here's basically what we do. We identify and evaluate risks of pipeline systems, develop inspection and enforcement for design, construction operations, and maintenance of pipelines carrying hazardous gas and liquids. We respond and investigate pipeline accidents and incidents. We have a new division called the Accident Investigation Division. They're now in Oklahoma City, and they have representatives spread out throughout the country. The guy that used to be our Western Region investigator is now over that division, so it's pretty good to have communication with him. We educate system operators, emergency responders, and the general public. Conduct research on promising technologies and knowledge needed to improve standards. We have a project or a grant with the Colorado School of Mines right now. When I started, the NTSB chairman accused us of being reactive, now trying to be proactive, and the mines research is trying to put it where we will be predictive. So it seemed to be some promising research, and hopefully he has about another year to finish that up. Doctor out of mines. We provide grants to states and support other safety programs. I believe this year 73% of the funding for the pipeline safety programs came from us, and our funding is authorized by Congress. So we have inspection, enforcement, damage prevention, and public education. All those have grants. We have technical assistance grants. You can get on our website and our web page and just go to grants, and it will show you all the stuff that's available to you. Some communities have actually done some studies. There's one out in California right now, checking an operator, and they have a grant. So, you know, it's about $25,000, but it helps them do that. Here's our goals. You know, of course, serious pipeline incidents through use of strong risk-based integrity management approach. I didn't have the slides here, but when I talk about our recent accidents or incidents in the region for interstate pipelines, really the last real serious ones were in 2015. So, you know, we're trying to keep it kind of quiet on the western front as far as the major pipelines. We're trying to, you know, be more data-driven, develop solutions to detect, characterize these risks, promote systematic management of risks through standards. That's where we're coming out with new regulations. Inspect and enforce integrity management standards. There was an operator on the Yellowstone River, gosh, this was like 2011. They didn't seem to want to worry about integrity management. They had a leak into the Yellowstone River. We fined them about $3 million. The cleanup was horrendous for them to pay for. And of course, EPA heavier. You get fined pretty good if you leak oil or any products. We're trying to build the capacity of communities to carry out their respective roles, living safely with the energy pipeline. So, you know, we're there. If you have any questions or any of that, this is the contact on interstate pipelines and any hazardous liquid pipelines that are big enough to be transportation, basically 8 inches or larger, and over what we call 20% of specified minimum yield strength. So, you know, if there's any questions, I think Joe will finish up in good fashion for you. You know, no questions right now. If you think of anything, just, oh, go ahead. Okay, the last one we shut down was actually, you know, some of them were shut down just for, until they got it repaired and it was safe. So that would be a week, you know, a week or two. But there's one out in California that leaked oil into a culvert that happened to go into the ocean, had Coast Guard and EPA on it. That was 10 miles of pipeline. It's still shut down. It was shut down in May of 2015. They haven't come up with anything we need, you know, safe to replace that pipeline. I don't think we let them repair it after all. You know, the ad spots were anomalous down on the pipeline. So, to give you an example, usually 1 or 2.
Julie Murphy.
You know,
I think commissioners, if they have questions, and then audience, if you have questions, maybe you can grab Tom afterwards. We'll turn it over to Joe Malloy now. Joe, you want to take a seat?
I think we have one question here first. Maybe Commissioner Eaton.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, Commissioner Eaton, I just wanted to clarify over here. In addition to setting standards, you also do direct inspections as well? Okay.
On all interstate pipelines.
On interstate.
And pipelines like hazardous liquid pipelines within the state of Colorado. We risk rank them, try to get them every other year, every 3 years. We only have like 20 inspectors to cover those 12 states, so, you know, we get pretty spread out.
Yeah.
We're trying to work with all our agencies. Joe's, I think, you know, we could always use more to get more inspections. That incident that happened in California, the fire marshal was on the infestation of hazardous liquid pipeline. Guess what? We doubled his staff.
Yeah.
So, you know, just an example.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I have a question. This is Commissioner Boygan. Minimum role and provide some requirements, and so what I'm interested
Okay, I'll hand it over to Joe real quick, but, you know, we have minimum standards. The state has to adopt them, so before they get certified, they have to adopt our minimum standards, but they are allowed to have more stringent standards, you know, based on localities and things like that. There's, I believe, PUC is more stringent on what we call the Class 1 gathering lines and stuff like that. So I'll let Joe kind of address the rest of it.
Okay, great. Joe Malloy, please introduce yourself and then please proceed.
I chose the wrong one. There's some fascinating information on this one, but I will actually speak to the subject of today's meeting, which is information about our program. To answer your question, Commissioner Boygan, everything starts with the federal government. That's not unusual in most environmental safety and health standards. for pipeline safety specifically. If you're interested, you can go to 49 U.S. Code, Chapter 601. That's pipeline safety. Now, as the Natural Gas Pipeline Safety Act, as it was enacted in the late 60s, has been amended multiple times over the years, it's this chapter, Chapter 601, which has the directives to U.S. DOT PHMSA to create the rules that provide those minimum safety standards. Those are found in 49 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 192 for hazardous gas pipelines, and 49 CFR Part 195 for hazardous liquid pipelines. Currently, the Public Utilities Commission is certified by PHMSA. Again, within Chapter 601, it directs PHMSA to certify states to perform certain inspections and to have programs and to provide funding for those programs in terms of a reimbursement grant. So currently, we are certified by PHMSA over at the PUC to inspect hazardous gas facilities. Now, it doesn't extend to interstate facilities, except as PHMSA requires our aid in any way. So anything that's intrastate, so that begins and ends in Colorado, is under the jurisdiction of the Public Utilities Commission's Pipeline Safety Program. Now, everyone should note that PHMSA is under US DOT, which is transportation. So the code, 49 USC Chapter 601, makes it clear that pipeline safety is over pipelines that are in transportation of hazardous gas or transportation of hazardous liquid. This isn't a verb, it's a concept. So transportation at the federal level means there's some form of commerce going on, some sort of vetted public interest. And this is how things have sort of filtered down over the years and have developed a somewhat discombobulated oversight of pipeline safety, because one could look at one pipeline and another pipeline, and material-wise and pressure-wise and commodity-wise, they might be the same thing. But in terms of the code, they're not. So the PUC's program is primarily over distribution companies such as Xcel, Atmos Energy, Black Hills Energy, transmission facilities, usually associated with those utilities. But it also extends to operators that are in the that are related to exploration and production. They're so-called midstream. They're bringing the produced oil and gas out from the field and bringing it into a transportation mode. So that includes gathering and transmission. Now again, a transmission line can look exactly like a gathering line, but its function is different. There's a definition within 49 CFR Part 192 and interpretations that go along with that by PHMSA over the years that don't exactly clarify, but they help. So we have distribution, transmission, or midstream, and then we get down to gathering, where the gaps are. Now, again, with public safety in mind, PHMSA developed codes that were based on population density. So where the exposure was seen to be greatest, that's where the most stringent regulations exist. And as you go away from these population centers, the regulations become less strict. Now, particularly for gathering, a transmission line is a transmission line in anybody's world. A gathering line has some very confusing definitions on what exactly it is, when it is, because if you reverse the flow one way, it could be an entirely different type of pipeline. And so for gathering, there are classes, just as there are for transmission. So there's classes 1 through 4, 4 being the most highly populated areas, 1 being rural. Now, it makes it clear, PHMSA makes it clear that they have jurisdiction over all pipelines. Now, this has been a subject of debate, and there might be some in this room that say it doesn't say that, but I think generally, if you ask a PHMSA administrator, they're going to say, well, we have authority over all those pipelines for safety reasons. In reality, they choose not to regulate certain segments. Particularly important in Colorado is that they choose not to regulate Class 1 gathering. So gathering in a rural setting as defined by that class location, and there's a technical equation that you go through in terms of how many buildings for habitation that are along the pipeline. If you want to get into that, I can get into that later. It's basically a formula saying, okay, this is a rural area, and so therefore we're going to have minimum requirements for this, which is, at this point, for Part 192, none. However, there is a gathering rulemaking that has been at USDOT PHMSA's nationwide level for some years, and I'm sure there's some people in this room that hope this rulemaking gets put out there at some point. So, for Colorado specifically, the PUC program adopts those minimum standards in 49 CFR Part 192 for hazardous gas. As Tom pointed out, states can have more stringent regulations. We do, in a sense. We identify Class 1 gathering. We've always identified that damages to those facilities are probably one of the biggest threats. And so, in our rules, every pipeline operator has to be part of 811. That is a rule that the COGCC recently put into place as well. And they have to have markers so we know where these facilities are. But at this point in time, that's all for Class 1 gathering. So if, did you have a question, Commissioner? I'm sorry. Well, you were giving me the third base steel home signal. So to explain what we do on regulated facilities, if you look at Part 192, it's quite broad. We have authority over construction, review of design, review of construction, review of operations and maintenance, review of emergency response, qualification of personnel operating the pipeline, even drug and alcohol programs. We also have authority over integrity management programs, both for distribution integrity management and transmission integrity management. Now, it's important to note that gathering is not part of that world of integrity management at this point. In Part 192, there's approximately 240 pieces of individual code. And for a mature pipeline operator, they will have 13 distinct programs to meet compliance with that code. So Xcel Energy has approximately 13 programs that are just compliance with Part 192. So it's very mature. Pipeline safety is a very mature environment in the utility world. As we get out into midstream, I think that it's a little, many of these operators are multi-state, they're national, so they do have good administrative programs, and their application in individual states can vary. We have 6 inspectors. We have approximately 5,000 miles of transmission in this state that we regulate, 850 miles of gathering. We have approximately 36,000 miles of distribution pipeline and about 1.9 million distribution services. And I think that sums it up, at least tees it up for you to have any sort of individual questions you might have. Commissioner Overturf.
Thank you. So you were discussing that the PUC has authority over construction, operation and maintenance, integrity management, and then you said, but currently the gathering lines are not part of this. And that's because the PHMSA, you have the authority through the delegation from PHMSA, but the PUC has not promulgated regulations subjecting gathering lines to those types of standards?
Actually, I just meant for integrity management purposes. So construction, operation, maintenance, qualification, all of the core, what I call the core portions of Part 192, we have authority over jurisdictional gathering for those.
Okay, so then same question, the integrity management, the gathering lines are not subject to that because that's not part of the delegation from PHMSA, or because PUC has chosen not to promulgate regulations at this time?
Oh, no, I mean, if it's in, we adopt by reference 49 CFR Part 192, so that is our code. The transmission, there is no gathering integrity management rule that has been promulgated by PHMSA.
So could the PUC adopt integrity management rules for gathering lines if it wanted to?
Absolutely. There's nothing preventing a state from going above and beyond the federal minimum standards for pipeline safety.
Okay, and is there any plan to adopt those types of rules by the PUC? Does the PUC have any plans to adopt those types of rules governing integrity management for gathering lines?
Not at this time.
Okay, that was all. Thank you.
Commissioner Eaton. Should I be going through the chair? I'm sorry.
Commissioner Eaton.
Thank you. And I just wanted to clarify on gathering lines. You're only talking about gathering lines from to midstream? I think this is where there seems to be a lot of questions about what's a gathering line and where is it regulated and so
There's probably people in this room that understand the schematic of what a gathering line is.
I would love to see that.
I think that would be an entire, I think that honestly, that would be an entire meeting just to understand that demarcation point. And there's movement in this new rulemaking by PHMSA to go away from the industry standard that used to be the sort of guiding document for that definition of a gathering line.
And you said that PHMSA rulemaking has been sort of on deck for a while. Do we have any sense about where it stands and when?
Can I always
Can you use
use this one?
And Mr. Finch, why don't you come up here and make sure you introduce yourself again so folks that are listening know who's speaking.
Tom Finch, USDOT.
And most importantly, in the microphone.
Western Region, PHMSA, Western Region. Sorry about that, I'm turning everywhere, Commissioner. But this new regulation has just, we have to go, what slows us down is Office of Management and Budget at the Department of the Secretary. It did just get passed, and it is coming out, but it's going to be what they call medium or middle consequence areas instead of high consequence areas. So the operator is going to be given, it's pretty intensive on integrity management, so they're going to be given 9 months to comply. So we might do courtesy inspections to see how they're, getting started on it. It'll be a lot like their regular integrity management program, but, more to come. The Secretary just announced that yesterday, to be honest with you. So, a lot of people didn't know about it, and I found out like at the end of last week. But, if you're interested in it, it's on our website, or I could send you more information on it, any of you.
And it covers gathering?
It's going to cover more gathering. We're not going to say all gathering. I still have to look at it. I remember it used to be a one-part rule, and it was so big, they called it the mega rule. It was 579 pages for one rule. I read about 180 that were the meat, and American Gas Association always redlines, and they had 80 pages of changes. So it got broken into 3 parts, and this is what we consider the main part. Another main part is we want operators to verify their MAOP, not just say, I'm grandfathered in, show us, make sure, because San Bruno was an instance where they grandfathered their MAOP, and I was there, I hate to tell you, but we asked them what kind of pipe they had in there, and it was 30-inch, and they said seamless. Now, I've never heard a 30-inch seamless made, and neither had Peter Katchmer. So, and of course, NTSB was there and wrote the report. So they were basing their MAOP on a perfectly great piece of pipe versus, we have these factors, versus, what was in there, a bunch of little pups that were put together right after World War II, basically. So, little pieces.
Mr. Malloy?
Yes, to clarify, and I probably, since Tom does community liaison, I probably have more recent information than calling Tom on the stage. But in that mega rulemaking, PHMSA approached both transmission and gathering. However, the gathering piece was stripped out of that. They're still debating that because it's going to be based on diameter. And there are certain states that have pushed against that diameter limit. And so that is not part of the current rollout.
Right, thanks.
But it's important to note that this new transmission rule will start affecting that midstream segment. But for now, that gathering rulemaking is on hold.
Yeah, but we expect it about the end of the year or so, to be honest with you. We're going part 2 on that and then part 3, so.
I think that Commissioner Boygan asked, what's the relationship between what you guys do and what we are doing or could be doing on this. So are you going to speak to that?
Thank you. If I can answer that, and this comes from my work on the Commission's previous flow line rulemaking, and so I would also defer to the advice of your legal counsel because these get into pretty sticky legal questions in my experience. As I see the legal landscape, COGCC has upstream oil and gas development, exploration and production. That's the scope of our authority. The feds have taken over pipelines and delegated specifically to PUC the piece that is the federal oversight. And so there's a statutory wall kind of between what COGCC does and what PHMSA and PUC do currently. PUC is authorized as the state, at the state level, to implement PHMSA's program and then is certified by PHMSA. We at COGCC don't have that. We have upstream oil and gas. And given the statutory limitations, which are easy to understand, I think, in words, and then you get into the field and it becomes a really different scenario because you're looking at the size of pipe, the type of fluid, and how many homes are located near it. And that gets it's hard for me to even fathom, right? And so what we did in the last rulemaking, or what the commission did in the last rulemaking, was say, okay, we're going to define our oversight of pipelines in Colorado to the broadest extent we can. We want to regulate everything associated with upstream oil and gas exploration and production that PHMSA, and as a result, PUC, does not. So if they don't regulate it, we're going to, and that's in our bucket. And that's the simplest way I can describe the difference between what we do and what they do. And so at COGCC, we are not implementing PHMSA's program, and we are not raising the federal floor on federally regulated or federally certified lines. That's PUC's job. So that's kind of what we're working on, and I think we've done a really great job of starting to build that structure for what it is that we regulate.
And Ms. Murphy, do we have like a fact sheet from the previous rulemakings? Because I think that'd be helpful for us to kind of see the lanes that people are supposed to be in.
I can circulate the former statement of basis and purpose if that would be helpful. I think that might be the most helpful document in that arena. I'll take a look.
Yeah. Commissioner Boygan?
I can answer that first. I think my recollection is that Mr. Elford did a PowerPoint question, frankly, flow line rulemaking a year ago. That might be helpful to redistribute that, maybe update it a little bit. Of course, it would be really helpful to have Stuart here to present.
He retired.
PowerPoint. But then I just wanted to follow up some of what's been discussed. I think it's clear, well, I'll just state the obvious, that when we talk about PUC, we're only talking about natural gas. So, and I'm assuming that does not include natural gas liquids.
Natural gas liquids.
That is correct.
That's ours.
So liquids are still either in PHMSA's bucket or somewhere in our bucket. To your point, Murphy, in saying that we, as a commission, undertook to regulate as much as we could. Give me a third microphone. Okay, is this better?
Yes.
All right. Great. So it
would be helpful, I think, to all of us to understand what that means in terms of liquids gathering and pipeline. What does this commission currently see as its role and its jurisdiction? And when Mr. Finch and Mr. Malloy, sorry, I had a brain lock there, talk about, well, the states can regulate more strictly or can have higher standards. That's a pretty facile statement that I'm not sure is entirely true, in the sense that we have preemption issues that we always have to think about, and it's been my experience that dominant sovereigns are not all that receptive to having regulation by lesser governments in their primary area, and so I guess I'd like some elaboration on that point.
Okay.
I'm skeptical about what states can do, what this state can do to regulate a PHMSA-regulated pipeline.
The key word for PHMSA is transportation. We only have jurisdiction over transmission pipelines. Anything, I mean, the transports that we call transportation. So the stuff that Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission does is not considered transportation until it gets to a source where it's being transported. And to answer your question on liquids, Part 194 is our part for the hazardous liquids, just like you have Part 192 for natural gas, and natural gas liquids are in there. Another one you wouldn't think of is carbon dioxide, and heaven forbid, now we don't have any of them, but anhydrous ammonia pipelines in the western region. So anything that's a hazardous liquid.
So if I could just follow that up. So what I'm drawing from this is that we as a commission can regulate up to whatever is regarded as transmission for natural gas liquids. And PHMSA would be okay with that.
Yes.
So that would exclude interstate pipelines, but theoretically could include gathering lines in the field that connect to interstate lines.
Yes.
Right?
Correct.
For liquids.
Yes. We meet every 3 months, 2 to 3 months, Joe and I and Mark, and this is stuff that we discuss. We want to make sure this operator isn't saying that's them and that's them. And I've even been with Stuart. We have a flow chart, and I didn't show it up there, but our gas gathering rules are extensive enough, you almost have to follow a flow chart. It was one of our inspectors that drew it out, showing is it jurisdictional or not, going all the way through. So, we've got copies of that too that we go over on if it's ours or Colorado Oil and Gas, or if it's natural gas, maybe Joe's.
Is that flow chart available online?
I don't believe so. I can send it to Mark or Julie.
This is Joe.
Yes, sir.
Work through,
Okay, I'm sorry.
And if people in the audience have follow-up questions, then that can occur in
Okay.
the hallway.
Okay.
But direct everything towards the commissioners. Ms. Murphy?
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner Boygan, to answer your question, on the liquid side, my understanding, and I should invite Mark up now because I'm a lawyer talking about engineering, which is real dangerous all the time, but is why we have the crude oil transfer line definition and regulations, is it's COGCC's exercise of jurisdiction over the lines that are carrying liquids that are not regulated by PHMSA or PUC. And so that's an important distinction. So I often talk generically about flow lines, and in my mind, they're including those crude oil transfer lines, but that's not apparent, and I should have articulated that earlier to each of you. But that is an important component of the regulatory authority that this commission exercised 18 months ago, and we'll be continuing to look at in a couple of months when we get to a rulemaking hearing. And so I really wanted to reemphasize that the point for me today of bringing these other experts into the room is so that you have a good grounding of where we do have authority and where we don't have authority. And during the stakeholder meeting, we had a lot of questions about why COGCC isn't regulating lines that are regulated by PUC or PHMSA. And from my perspective, and again, I'm a policy human being, not one of you, I'm not sure we have the regulatory authority to go there today. And so I would encourage all of us to really focus in on what we do have authority over, and in preparation for thinking about what you want to do in the upcoming rulemaking hearing.
Thank you. I'm just going to see if I understand. And so what I'm hearing between PHMSA versus PUC versus COGCC, and I'll focus specifically on COGCC and what regulatory authority we do have over regulating flow lines. And so what I'm hearing right now, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just trying to make sure I understand, is that the COGCC, there's a hole right now that the COGCC should fill regarding regulating integrity management of gathering lines. Because currently the PUC does not regulate integrity management of gathering lines, nor does PHMSA through the PUC. This is what I've heard from over here. Am I correct there?
Yes.
I think that's a correct, thank you, Chair. I think that's a correct statement as to what they're doing. I don't know that we have the authority to go into the PUC's program. Or
Not specifically.
So yeah, I think this is the key thing, that there is this gap where integrity management of gathering lines is there are currently no standards governing integrity management of gathering lines. It appears to me that we are not necessarily the agency that has authority to establish those standards, even if we wanted to, because that's something that's been delegated to the PUC. But it does seem, if you step back and look at it from a broader, if you kind of get out of the trees and look at the forest, that it doesn't make a ton of sense that we have these strong integrity management standards for flow lines, and then as soon as that flow line turns into a gathering line, there's no standards, and then potentially standards pick up again once you get into the PHMSA or you get upped in the class or the grade. And so I wonder if there isn't, recognizing that Mr. Malloy stated that the PUC isn't currently considering rules establishing integrity management standards for gathering lines, is there an opportunity for us to work together to propose, as a sister agency, to tell them, like, hey, these are the integrity management standards that we came up with for flow lines. We think they'd be largely relevant and applicable to gathering lines. Do what you will with it. We would really encourage you to also reflect these same standards in your regulation of gathering lines. Is that something that we're considering, or is that a conversation that's happening between the PUC and the COGCC?
Ms. Murphy?
Chair, Commissioner Overturf, it's a good question, and as these three gentlemen have, I've sat in a number of meetings with these three gentlemen who are really working together to make sure that we're doing the best that we can under the regulatory authorities that we have promulgated to protect the state of Colorado, and I think that that's an important component. I think we'll continue to explore how we can work together to better regulate, to gain efficiencies in that space. And
Commissioner Messner, and then Commissioner Hopkins.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask one other question, a couple other questions. So, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I acknowledge that this cooperation, this communication between the PUC and the COGCC as far as dealing with integrity management on gathering lines is, in my opinion, clearly a necessary path forward. But to your point, if what I'm hearing from PHMSA is that states are allowed to go above the minimum standard that's developed, and the PUC is choosing not to go above the minimum standard, then why would the COGCC not have authority to go above the minimum standard, as it appears that we would have the authority from PHMSA?
Ms. Murphy?
Chair, thank you. Commissioner Mesner, we're not the certified program. And so we at COGCC don't have the certification from PHMSA, and we at COGCC don't have the statutory authority to regulate in the gathering and transportation space. It's because it's transportation that PUC has a pipeline safety program. Because PHMSA regulates transportation, transportation is something that we typically think of as regulated by the Public Utilities Commission. I assume that's why the pipeline safety program delegated by PHMSA landed at PUC and not at COGCC. It's really the transportation component, and we are upstream regulators.
Okay.
Commissioner Hopkins?
Don't want to complicate this more than I should, but I think I'm going to throw one more thing out there. There's a growing desire by operators to start to use gathering lines in residential areas to lower truck traffic and such. So I think we're going to see more pipeline gathering type issues near residential neighborhoods. And I guess my question is there a role for the local government to participate in the regulation of those types of things in their jurisdiction? I don't know whether SB 181 addresses this or not, or whether not COGC was going to think about this or not. But I know, for example, I'm familiar with some agreements where the cities or the local government has put more stringent standards in through their negotiations with the operator. So I just wanted to see what you all think about from a local government perspective.
Ms. Murphy?
Chair and Commissioner Hopkins, I don't know the federal delegation space well enough to articulate what role the local has in that arena, so I would prefer to not answer, and maybe we can follow up separately either, unless Mr. Finch and Mr. Malloy can.
Commissioner,
Mr. Finch?
It's actually up to the community, the city or the county to, give them the permit. On interstate natural gas lines, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission gets involved in siting, but DOT nor PUC is allowed to, we don't have anything to do with siting of pipelines. So if it's hazardous liquid or natural gas, that's not FERC regulated, then it's up to each county and community. I know we dealt with the city of Aurora already. We were glad to go over what we have for regulations. We all had a meeting at the city of Broomfield, and we were asked who was going to regulate what. It ended up that we had the oil line, they had the wastewater line, and he had the natural gas line. So basically that same thing was going to be looked at, by 3 different agencies.
Okay, so you all do work with the local governments on those types of permitting issues?
Well,
figure out who has authority?
We don't have any authority on it. It's just, we can advise, what we think.
Consulting role?
Yeah.
But they actually issue the permits?
Yes, they issue the permits.
For right away and that type of thing?
Correct.
Mr. Malloy?
Chairman, thank you. Commissioner Hopkins, it really depends on the municipality or the locality reaching out to us, because oftentimes with an unregulated line, they don't have to submit a construction notice to either us or PHMSA. So if we don't know about it, we can't consult with them. So I think that if there's any sort of municipality or local authority in the room that has any questions, they can certainly reach out to either Tom or myself, speaking for Tom.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Yeah. Commissioner Boygan.
Again, at the risk of belaboring some of this, I want to go back to a point that Ms. Murphy made. I think it's critical here. You are saying that under the Oil and Gas Conservation Act, this commission's jurisdiction is limited to upstream regulation, exploration, production. Therefore, we don't have broad authority to regulate all gathering midstream operations in the state, even if PUC doesn't regulate it, because, for example, it's liquids, and even if PHMSA would be fine with us regulating it. I think I'm hearing you say we don't actually have the authority, statutory authority to regulate it. There might be questions somebody could raise whether 181 changed that. I'm not sure that it did, but at some point, I guess we'll address that in the rulemaking. So one piece of the puzzle here might be, is additional statutory authority necessary in order for the commission to do what it decides it wants to do during the course of this rulemaking? Am I hearing you correctly?
Ms. Murphy?
Thank you, Chair. And Commissioner Boygan, at the risk of treading into areas that your AG is better poised to advise you on, I think that you've correctly stated the lay of the legal land as I understand it, that the Commission has limited authority. My reading of 181 did not broaden the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission's authority over additional oil and gas operations to include transportation or gathering. There is language in Senate Bill 19181 that I think, but I would have to defer to the actual CDPHE folks and their AGs. I think that there is language in Senate Bill 19181 that broadens the Air Quality Control Commission's authority over gathering. And so I worry that some people might read those differently than I do and present you with a different argument about that. But I do agree that our authority in this space is limited.
Thank you. Any more questions? Mr. Malloy, you were explaining earlier this rating system 1 to 4, 1 to 5. If you're designated as a number 1, which I think is rural, more rural, and there's a definition somewhere, I'm sure it looks at population issues. But whether you're 1 through, is it 1 through 4 or 1 through 5, first of all?
It's 1 through 4.
4, okay. So if you're 1 through 4, does everyone have the same level of standard, and is there the same amount of oversight over safety? So if you're in a number 1, do inspections take place just as frequently as a number 4, or tell me about that different of standard, or is there any difference?
Your line of questioning is correct. I think I know where you're going. Yes, I mean, the more rural a pipeline is, the less of a risk it poses to public safety based on that ranking. We're talking about population density. We're not talking about any sort of unity measure of safety. So if you lived in one area with a class 1 pipeline and Commissioner Davenport or Commissioner Hopkins lived elsewhere, the pipelines in Commissioner Hopkins' area might be inspected more, simply because there's more activity, there's more development. So there's reasons for it, but you're correct that rural areas do not get as many pipeline safety inspections as populated areas.
Thank you. Commissioner Eden?
Thank you. Just to follow up on that. Are there different standards or just different frequency of?
If you're talking, I'm sorry.
Mr. Malloy?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies. Commissioner Eaton, yes, it depends on the classification of the pipeline. If it's a gathering pipeline, then there are different gathering pipelines are stacked or are related closely with transmission pipelines. So say a gathering pipeline in a class 3 area at a certain pressure is equivalent in all respects, most respects, to a transmission line, except for those integrity management rules. But the lower in stress that you get, the lower in diameter, the lower in population density, the less regulation is imposed. Now, if we're talking about class 1 gathering, there's essentially no regulation except for the requirement to notify us if something goes wrong. That's under our rules, under our state rules. They need to belong to the Colorado 811 Center, so they need to engage in damage prevention, and they need signage. So that's the extent of the rules as we know it today.
Commissioner Overturf.
And I think that tiered approach, given that it comes out of a concern about safety, that helps explain why there's that sort of tiered approach of different standards depending on how many people you're close to. But it does overlook that leaks that cause emissions of methane from a rural gathering line are just as damaging to our environment and our climate as leaks that occur from flow lines that are regulated from the COGCC or from interstate transmission pipelines. And so I wonder if there's it seems like a piece of this conversation that's missing is, that I honestly don't know the answer to, is what is the air quality regulatory rubric that applies to these pipelines? And would it be possible for us to get some information from perhaps the Air Pollution Control Division about how they approach pipelines from an inspection and enforcement standpoint? Do they follow the same class 1 to class 4 inspection sort of classifications, or do they sort of treat all pipelines the same? Do they inspect them as part of their oil and gas unit? I don't know the answers to those questions. So that would be a piece of this conversation that I would certainly be curious in learning more about.
I would just second that. I mean, we have different, we don't have different clean air or clean water standards just because you live in rural Colorado versus a more urban area. So as someone that comes from a rural area, that's very important. But any follow-up?
Chair.
Yeah. Ms. Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. And Commissioner Overturf, my extremely high-level, one-sentence understanding of the air quality piece is that air quality is looking at components, not pipeline. And my understanding is there isn't a distinction. The way that we have such interesting, complicated distinctions as it relates to the integrity management side. And I'm happy to talk to Chris LaPlante and see if he would be willing to come give an overview of what CDPHE has in place right now and perhaps even where it may be going.
Any more follow-up questions or comments? See none. Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Next up, COGCC staff flow line rulemaking update. Ms. Murphy.
Thanks, Chair. And I'm afraid I probably used all of my firepower during the last presentation. I don't really have much more to say about where we are on flow lines, except that Director Robbins relayed that we had a stakeholder meeting. We had some robust participation. I think stakeholders are really keyed into this question of regulatory authority and scope. I think stakeholders are also really keyed into the Senate Bill 19-181's requirement to create publicly available information about the flow lines that COGCC does regulate. I was glad that Mr. Finch displayed the map, the federal map that PHMSA maintains, and wanted to note a couple of things about it. One, that it is a nationwide map, but if you want to look at segments more locally, you can only look at them county by county. And also, if you get to a scale of less than 1 to 24,000, you cannot see where those pipelines are anymore. And I believe that that's a safety piece. And so I think that's important information for us to keep in mind. One, what their regulatory space is versus ours, how their map works, because those are questions I anticipate stakeholders will bring to you based on that stakeholder meeting we had. And from there, we're continuing to work hard with stakeholders. We hope to we will have a set of draft rules out on October 8th around flow lines and the implementation of Senate Bill 19-181, the amendment, what I call subpart 19, it's on page 22, I think, that relates to what COGCC is doing on inactive, shut-in, temporarily abandoned flow lines and idle wells. And I'm going to give a little preview to what we're going to talk about this afternoon we had finally received the SOGR idle well report that had some important information, and that's helped us shape where we want to go on implementing both the SOGR report and also Senate Bill 19-181 as it relates to inactive, idle, temporarily abandoned and shut-in wells. So if you have any questions about where we are in the process, happy to take them, and also happy to talk more offline if you have really detailed questions.
Commissioner Eaton.
I just want to thank you for that, and then we're going to have both a conversation and also a public comment, further public comment on flow lines this afternoon. So I think that that's great, and that we continue to have these opportunities for people to raise and ask these questions. And so, thank you.
Chairman Gibbs, can I point out one thing we do have for public officials or whatever, such as yourself, emergency responders, access. You can get granted access to more detailed mapping. It's called PIMA, P-I-M-M-A, and when you get on our website for the National Pipeline Mapping System, it'll show you and tell you how you got to apply for access. Our mapping person in DC, approves almost, once they're proven to be a commissioner or a member or emergency responder, they'll give them access to that more detailed mapping. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any more questions or comments before we take a break? Seeing none, it's 11:06. Let's come back at 11:20. How's that sound? Great, thank you.
We just have to put it in place and show it.
All right, we're going to come back to order here.
Your microphones are live.
This microphone seems to be working really well now. So please take a seat if you want to continue your conversations. If they don't have anything to do with what we have before us, please go out in the hallway. But we're going to be starting up here on docket number 1901-00008, Magpie Operating Incorporated. This is an update from Magpie on operations and activities since January 2019, stipulated OFV hearing. And to kick this off, we'll have David Beckstrom.
Thank you, Chairman Gibbs. Good morning, Commissioners. This is Assistant Attorney General David Beckstrom. I'm here joined by Magpie to provide an update that was requested by the Commission upon the approval of a stipulated order finding violation with Magpie. So a little bit of brief background on this case, and then I'm going to turn it over to Magpie to give you the update. This Commission approved an order finding violation against Magpie for a number of violations at 2 different locations. The terms of that agreement and that order finding violation were a little bit complex because we saw an opportunity to allow Magpie to turn a corner on their operations and return a lot of their locations to compliance and then remain in compliance. So at its most basic, there was a penalty of $267,000 and some odd dollars imposed for the violations. $87,000 of that was required as a cash payment, and the remaining $180,000 was remitted to the Commission as additional financial assurance for Magpie's operations. Where this update comes from is that the additional $180,000 in financial assurance is to remain in place pending the successful completion of a compliance plan as well as a 2-year period of compliance with the COGCC's various rules. That is more or less the high-level update. Part of the compliance plan required remediation of the environmental issues at the 2 locations for which the order was initially issued. And the rest of it really requires that Magpie be very responsive to staff's identification of any field issues or other compliance issues. So with that, I will turn it over to Magpie to give you an update on both the remediation and their ongoing compliance with COGCC regulations. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And for the record, I know there's 3 of you, but please introduce yourself. And obviously you represent Magpie, but if you represent any other folks as well, just let us know who you represent.
Sure. Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Eric Wackerlin. I'm an attorney at Holland & Hart and outside counsel for Magpie in this matter.
Ryan Warner, Magpie Operating Inc.
I'm Tricia Fanning with Eagle Environmental Consulting for Magpie.
So we don't have a whole lot for you today. Like David said, our presentation is just a quick couple slides updating you on the progress at the two sites in the OFE. So Tricia's with Eagle's gonna go through what's been going on out there.
And just to clarify with regards to history, the two sites, one was Little Beaver, number 25. That site, there was actually no significant remediation at that site. We actually did do a full assessment. The site was plugged and abandoned, and the remediation number and the site has been totally closed out, and that was actually done before the hearing, for the OFE hearing. The second site is the Little Beaver Injection Unit, and since April 2018, we did a full assessment of that property. Currently, as represented in the slide, we conducted groundwater and soil assessment. We've installed 27 monitoring wells. We've had approximately 4,400 cubic yards of soil that were excavated and remediated in situ process. Additionally, we have groundwater sampling that's been ongoing in the area that was of concern that was determined initially back in 2018 or subsequent years. That area is actually in non-detect by the analytical. We've kind of reached out on the property. We've added additional wells in April and in August. We're currently monitoring 18 wells for groundwater. 2 only contain any level of BTEX constituents in them. So the site is very cleaned up at this point. And we have ongoing groundwater sampling that occurs on a quarterly basis, and our quarterly groundwater sampling event is next scheduled for October. So the site is monitored natural attenuation going very well. Additionally, as we agreed when we met in January, as part of the agreement, it wasn't written in the agreement, but the commission at the time had requested an update within 6 months. We got pushed, so that's why we're presenting today. Since January 1st of this year, we've had COGCC inspections at 58 different inspections throughout Magpie's facilities. We had 13 corrective actions of record. All corrective actions to date have been addressed in a timely manner and closed out. That's pretty much it at this point. Any questions?
Any questions? I think none at this time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are going to use the time we have here to move the schedule on a little bit to be able to have the update on State Oil and Gas Regulatory Exchange. And I believe that Julie Murphy will present this, and Diana Byrne, just to use our time. And we'll just take a brief moment while we get ready for this next presentation. So let's, Enrique, we can turn this off. So let's just take a quick 5-minute break as we get ready for the next presentation.
Okay, we're going to get started back up again. And it is 11:32. And Ms. Murphy, you want to kick off this particular section?
I'm sure everybody's a little bit tired of hearing my voice at this point in time, but bear with me. We're going to run through quickly a report that we received from the State Oil and Gas Regulatory Exchange, and that is a peer-to-peer opportunity for states to request review of particular subsets of their rules, and other state regulatory experts take a look and make recommendations to improve them. As a quick contextual point, as a result of Firestone, Governor Hickenlooper issued or ordered a number of different measures that the state undertake in response, and one of those was that COGCC would request SOGR, or the state oil or the exchange, to review 4 subsets of its rules. If you recall from June, we presented to you one of those reviews on wellbore integrity, and this is the second review that has been completed by the exchange, and it covers COGCC's idle well rules. This is a very timely report to have received, given that Senate Bill 19181 directs the Commission to undertake a number of rulemaking topics, including wellbore integrity, including consideration of inactive wells, and updating any environmental protections necessary, and also what inspections are necessary as if an idle well is to be reactivated, in addition to fee authority, in addition to looking at financial assurance. And so with that, I think I would hand it off to Diana to actually dive into the details of the report's recommendations, to walk you through what it says. I believe that Mimi or someone will email a copy of the report out, has emailed a copy of the report to each of you. It's not terribly long, but I think it might be helpful to have Diana explain it instead of reading it cold. So with that, Diana.
And Diana, before you get started, Commissioners, I want to apologize for the fact that half of you cannot see the report, so I think you can see it on Zoom.
You can, and I did just also send out the PowerPoint to the commissioners, so if you're able to access your email and pull that up.
Pull up the PowerPoint, you can see it that way, or you can
walk around.
Obviously walk around. I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page before we get going.
No.
That sounds great. So, yeah, Ms. Byrd, whenever you're ready.
Alrighty, thank you. Apologize. The exchange, as Julie said, it's a peer review, so it's it's a nice feature of the IOGCC and the GWPC. So we were fortunate that there were no glaring errors or gaps that they found. So what we feel like we got was tweaks that we can make with our processes and our rules. So we're going to talk about the peer assessment, and well, I just did, sorry. And then what's considered an idle well, what were their assessments, and then also they have recommendations based on those assessments. So that's where we're going to go. We already discussed this, that it's a state-led initiative, and it's a partnering between the IOGCC, the GWPC, and then those regulators and participants in those organizations. It's a collaborative effort, so other states are the ones that reach out and take their time to review your rules in the context of what you're asking them to review for. So they're looking at best practices, and then also sometimes they know of technologies that we may not be aware of, and to be able to incorporate those things into your rulemaking. So for us, we have a variety of different idle wells and in different contexts. So we have idle wells in the context of financial assurance and the requirements that's caused by being an idle well. And then we have the ones where we're concerned about mechanical integrity and assuring that if it's sitting there, that it's not a potential source of contamination. So from the bonding perspective, or the financial assurance piece, an inactive well is a well that has not sold product or injected for 12 months, or if it's been declared temporarily abandoned, 6 months. So that's one of those things that there's multiple layers to evaluate. So for our world, a shut-in well, so this is in the context of both the financial assurance and then with mechanical integrity, it's a well that's capable of production, it's just not currently producing. And when we say capable of production, we have a colloquial, I can flip a switch, turn a valve, or start a prime mover, and the well will start producing again. So it doesn't require any mechanical intervention to bring it back to production. Temporarily abandoned well is one that's incapable of production, usually purposefully, not always purposefully, but it's going to require some sort of mechanical intervention to restore that well's productive capability. So it could have been that the pump jack's motor was being fixed, or there's not flow lines attached to that well. It can be that the downhole plug was placed in that well and needs to be removed before the well can be put back in production. So there's a variety of things that can render a well temporarily abandoned. Why would an operator shut in well? So there's a variety of reasons. Sometimes you just have to let the well build pressure back up again so it can produce. In our world right now with the horizontal activity, we have people shutting them in for offset activities to sort of protect the existing well. You create a little bit of a back pressure, hopefully that you don't get, the stimulation doesn't come in and impact that well. You may be focusing on a different part of your field, so you just shut that one in so that it can do its thing later. And the temporarily abandoned ones are ones that typically are needing more than just shutting them in. So there may be some repairs that need to be made, or again, offset activity that you want to protect the well, and you've done it with a solid mechanical device so that you'll have to remove it later. We have suspended operations. So this is a well that was stopped drilling before it reached its permitted total depth. And this could be for a variety of reasons. You'll see this, we would consider that with when people are utilizing a sputter rig, where all they do is go out with a smaller rig, set the surface casing, and then they move that well off, or they move that rig off that pad, and they'll cycle back with the big rig that will be capable of drilling the well to depth. And so suspended operations are typically that right now. It's not so much that there's a downturn or anything, it's more that that's the process of drilling that's being utilized. There are a few out there that are still hanging out there that got caught in a downturn a few years ago. And then waiting on completions. These are drilled and cased to the permitted depth, but they haven't had their formations or their objective formations opened up, and so they're incapable of flowing. There's a variety of reasons for this. It could be the campaign. You've got the drill rig now, first part of the year, and then you've got the stimulation crews coming the second part of the year. Or it could be that leaseholds. It could be that the drill rig's faster than the stimulation crew. And so you'll also hear people call these ducks. So those are available to be completed. Thankfully, they're brand new wells, so in terms of mechanical worries, that isn't a huge issue for those.
And DUC stands for drilled but uncompleted.
Yes.
So DUC.
So with the idle well concerns that we have, and one of the reasons that the ask was made of SOGRA to review our rules is we want to assure that we're assessing that mechanical integrity regularly and documenting it. And then also the financial assurance piece is huge. So that was part of the ask, and seeing how other states may be dealing with financial assurance and the different models out there. So the assessments that came back from SOGR are, you know, it's making sure there's an operator out there that cares is kind of one of the assessments. So that's difficult, but hopefully that in paying attention to these things and creating methodologies that we're monitoring brings us better awareness and better capabilities there. And then also from the state's perspective, understanding the need of the operator to, while they're maintaining wells that are incapable of production, that they still have to maintain those wells that are capable of production, that there is a balance there, and not necessarily want to just go plug everything tomorrow kind of approach, that there may have to be, there is the required understanding that you can't just have edicts necessarily that do that. Defining remaining utility with wells is something that they concentrated on, and it's something that we struggle with to determine what that future utility is and whether or not it's a realistic plan or if it's just a placeholder. So that's part of it, that require them to demonstrate the mechanical integrity, but also allowing them that ability to, if there is future utility and a realistic future utility, that they can utilize those wells. So they did come back and say that we had very comparable requirements and approaches with protecting the state from the liability of wells needing to be abandoned if an operator becomes an absentee operator. They said that one of the things is you can have all the rules on the book, but the enforcement is really what counts. So developing that approach that we're consistent and take what we do have in our rule book and apply it so that we do minimize that liability to the best of our abilities. So internally, we've strengthened our procedures. We're doing a quarterly review based on what we would call an overdue MIT. So the query is, it looks for a shut-in well, it looks for a well that's been declared temporarily abandoned, and then it prompts, there's a warning letter sent out that says, it appears that this well is in need of a mechanical integrity test, and assure that your reporting is correct. That's happening quarterly. And then there's the follow-up at the end of that quarter is to see what the results are of that warning letter. So if the MIT was required or the mechanical integrity test was required, has it been performed? Has it been documented? Where does that well stand? And following through, if it failed a mechanical integrity test, then is it being repaired to be successfully tested for mechanical integrity, or is it going to be plugged and abandoned, or has it been plugged and abandoned? So those procedures are necessary in our view for both the mechanical integrity side and also for the financial assurance side, to make sure that if we see a rise in an operator's inventory of shut-in wells or inactive wells, the very first one, so no production, that threshold is easier to meet than the mechanical integrity one of the 2 years typically for a shut-in well. So the inactive triggers additional financial assurance on a per well basis above and beyond what would be covered by the blanket bond if there's too many of them. So to the recommendations from SOGR, they wanted operators to regularly demonstrate mechanical integrity of idle wells. This didn't really differ from our current requirements. There was really nothing in there that differed from our current requirements. It would just be us keeping current with those requirements and dealing with the operators and ensuring that they're doing what they need to be doing. We are going to take it to adding Braden head testing as a requirement for all wells. There's some parts of the state right now that have it on a biannual basis. Those would probably stay at the biannual, but for those areas that aren't already defined as needing as an annual Braden head test, we would take it that would be a requirement. So that's an intermediate step then to a full-blown mechanical integrity test, but it does give you some insight to the integrity of the wellbore. Yeah, and the wellbore integrity recommendations from SOGR also touched on annual requirements for Braden head testing. So that is our intention, to include that with the rulemaking that will happen with the wellbore integrity. The recommendation was that operators are required to provide notice for mechanical integrity tests. That is already a written or It's a rule that they provide written notification for MITs in our world, so that is not a change for us. Periodically review idle wells was a recommendation, so we feel like we're doing this now with the quarterly review. It's currently happening. She started a couple weeks ago. There was one done at the beginning of June, so those will cycle and come due September 30th. So the first week of October, we will look at the results of those warning letters and what progress has been made. If progress hasn't been made, they are referred to enforcement. And again, and also, while we do it for mechanical integrity, our financial assurance group is also doing it annually with a subset of operators to assure that the financial assurance that they have with the state is in agreement with the number of inactive wells that they have. This one's tough, I can tell you. Ensure operator-defined future utility is specific and real. Sometimes their specific and real is very different than our specific and real, so that makes it difficult. As part of this process, we're hoping that we can utilize economics that it's spelled out, that economics would have to be defined, or a real plan. I can tell you right now, we get ones in, it's like we're waiting for the price of gas to go up before this is economic. Well, yay, we all are, but in terms of evaluating how long that well should be allowed to sit out there with sort of a pie-in-the-sky goal for a price is difficult. And so we hope to put parameters on that and make future utility specific and real.
So just clarification, so the pricing of what's on the market now is not considered a reason for what's specific and real for the operator?
No, it's specific and real. It is. Like I had one the other day that said we need gas to be at $3.50. You're like, okay, well, when? And in the meantime, what's the plan? And it's, I think, more difficult when they're gas wells. They're drilled in a gas zone. That's all they have. There isn't really uphole opportunities to recomplete or deepen and have a liquid-based production. So it becomes more difficult, I think, to just go, it's never going to be 350 in the next generation. So different plan, please. So did I answer that?
Ms. Murphy?
Thanks. And I think it's probably helpful context to say that the general process to stay inactive or T8 or idle, you'll have to correct me, Diana, is a form comes into the director identifying, you're going to this?
Yeah, go ahead.
Never mind.
Go ahead.
Okay, and so the operator submits a form saying we've been inactive for a year or idle for a year, and we're going to continue to stay idle to allow for until the price of gas comes up. And so those are the kinds of filings we're getting currently. I think one of the recommendations that Diana is going to get into is, should that be a different process? What should that process look like? Who should the decision maker be? Is that allowance to stay idle after a year indefinite? Those are the kinds of questions I think that this report raises.
Yeah, so what currently happens is that's an annual request. So if the well is shut in, that's one thing we do need to tighten. A shut-in well doesn't require that request. So if they have declared that I could walk up to that well, flip a switch, turn a valve, or start a prime mover, that evaluation piece doesn't have to take place. And so we do have operations that literally will turn on that well in the 23rd month for a day. And they sort of skirt the issue of having that mechanical integrity test and the justification for that well to sit out there and produce one day every 2 years. So that is one thing we would like to try and tackle with this going forward. But if it's temporarily abandoned and that it cannot produce for whatever reason, we do have a requirement that that's an annual request, that you ask for continued temporarily abandoned status, and as part of that, the rule specifies that you have to declare your future plans for that well. But we kind of have that loophole right now with these shut-in, long-term ones, that they don't have to play that and ask us for that continued status. Another recommendation from SOGRA is ensure that the bonding requirements adequately cover states' plugging costs. And I think we would take this to not only is it the plugging cost, but very often the reclamation can cost more than the plugging itself. So we would probably want to expand upon this recommendation, and that when we're looking at the bonding requirements or the financial assurance requirements, that we take into consideration those costs also. So when you're asking someone to provide additional financial assurance because they've crossed a finite threshold of the number of wells, that's the number that's increased. It's not, currently it's a finite $20,000 per well. If it's greater than 3,000 foot, if it's less than 3,000 foot, it's $10,000 per well. So that wouldn't get us very far with either a plugging or a reclamation in today's world. They also recommended considering an idle well fee. We're open to any of these suggestions. And then they talked to considering legislating that it goes all the way back to prior operators. Again, we're open to all viable solutions. This is what they offered. The end. Hi.
Questions? Commissioner Eden, just so folks listening to.
Sorry, when you say it would go back to previous operators, what would go back?
Liability.
Liability for shut-in and reclamation. Or for-
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to sort of opine a little bit. I think what we see right now, too, is in the current state, we've got operators that may be taking the opportunity to give it to a less capable operator. And when I say give, it's probably not quite give, but they're unloading liabilities. And so I think that was part of the intention also of SOGRA, is that making the precursor aware that they may still have continued liabilities even if they are not the current operator of record.
Yeah. Commissioner Messner and then Commissioner Whiting.
So around idle well or suspended wells, and how often do you see operators come in and receive the permits to do and then do a spud well, or drill a spud well, and then go idle until market conditions allow it to be financially feasible to move further along?
Currently, I think what you'll see is instead of drilling out an entire pad, they will drill and complete all the way to perforations and production, a single well on that pad. I think the bigger operators have DUCs, but they're planned DUCs. That's part of their approach. It's, capital constraints, leaseholds, whatever, but those aren't the worrisome ones usually. That's usually a pad that's drilled completely out. It's merely awaiting stimulation. Right now, we did have a handful of wells that were spud this week that came in with TA sundries, but they're very, very minute portion.
Got a follow-up, Dan? So, I guess I'm trying to understand, as we, look further into these things. Certainly, most of the operators out there are not trying to circumnavigate any kind of loopholes or, jump through any of the loopholes, but certainly some are. And so I think you indicated some of the loopholes that they utilize in order to be able to circumnavigate mechanical integrity testing or some other regulatory processes. Can you elaborate a little more on that, so as we go a little further into this, we can really understand, you know, because it appears to me that one of the challenges here is that we've got operators that potentially are looking at market conditions, want to get through a permit process, and then want to get to a stop stage until market conditions, you know, make it more feasible for them to continue with operations, which perhaps leads to unnecessarily drilled wells.
My gut says that isn't where our issues lie right now. I think a lot with the newly drilled stuff, their demonstration and the capability to produce a reservoir, and they almost have a need to demonstrate that for ongoing operations for themselves. So it's not necessarily the new wells, it's the aging population that is really where the concern lies. That as you get a diminished gas price and your gas oil ratio of those older wells starts to creep up, that it makes it more difficult for that one to be economic. And we have quite a population of that, especially when you look at the Eastern Plains development that were J-sand, the southeastern stuff that tends to be dry gas, the northeastern stuff that tends to be dry gas. So the ability for the capital flow to generate enough to justify drilling a new gas well is hard to kind of bump up against that threshold because the current productivity is diminishing along with those older wells. Answer?
That's helpful, thank you.
It's not, our current concern isn't really the new ones so far, thankfully.
Commissioner Boygan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to focus a little bit more on the issue of shut-in versus TA wells. I mean, to me, that's kind of where the gap is, or the challenge is, because I think basically you're relying on operators to tell you that the wells are shut in as opposed to being TA'd. I'm not sure you have the capability of going beyond that. You can tell me I'm wrong. You can tell me that you do have effective ways of determining whether wells are truly shut in as opposed to TA. Just as a side note, on shut-in wells, you get into pretty complicated issues under oil and gas leases in terms of being able to hold leases by shutting in wells and the circumstances under which you can shut in wells. And whether or not wells are capable of producing and paying quantities. There's a whole body of case law that deals with that, and I'd venture to say that there's not authority in most state commissions to require wells to be plugged just based on a regulatory body's assessment that, oh, that well can't produce in paying quantities anymore, or you're not truly holding that well with a future expectation of operating it at a profit. Or I think that's a pretty slippery slope and a challenge. And I'm not sure that's where you think this is going or not, but that's a whole different level of regulatory involvement than simply determining mechanical integrity.
Yes.
It's kind of a long series of questions and comments. Basically, shut-in versus TA is what I'm primarily concerned about.
Right. So we do have a few tools. We can, if it looks like, you know, we see 1 MCF on the 23rd month, making them demonstrate that that ability to produce that 1 MCF and sell it, because that's what the paperwork says. But then additionally, I think that that's where, though we may not have the ability to plug the well, or dictate that the well is plugged, because they've determined that there is viability at some future point, we do have the ability to say, all right, it has to demonstrate mechanical integrity, but now we're going to enter into this world where you're going to start to bond up. If you're going to declare that it has future utility, then put up the money to prove it and sort of make that a meeting of continuing additional financial assurance payments to the point where we have that in our back pocket, however you want to characterize it, that if we needed to, we would have the funds to do it. But they then get to make the choice, is it better to invest with additional financial assurance, or should I go ahead, drill a new well to hold that lease, do whatever to further develop that well to hold the lease?
Can I follow up? So what is your remedy if the operator doesn't put up the financial assurance in that situation?
We don't currently have that, except for the current one is just the bonding up to the, either the 20,000 or the 10,000. And they may not even have to do that if the blanket bond covers the number of wells that they have in the shut-in, temporarily abandoned status. So the hope is that through this process with the rulemaking is that ability to change those requirements with regards to the requirements for temporarily abandoned or shut-in wells are escalated, and that after a finite number of years or however it's chosen, that needs to happen, that stepwise increase. I think stepwise is probably better than, on day 366, please send me your check for $70,000 or whatever, depending on which part of the state you're in, for that plugging in abandonment and the reclamation.
So what I'm hearing is that there is not currently a mechanism, there's a limited bonding mechanism to deal with inactive wells, but it's not where what you're talking about in terms of a step up and a continuing sort of monitoring and assessment situation. So that'll be addressed in the rulemaking at some point. And the corollary to that is the issue of what happens if the operator doesn't come up with the additional bonding. We haven't really faced that yet. We tend to get it when we're dealing with orphan wells and there's basically nobody around, or there's a limited bond that's available to take, which doesn't come close to covering the actual costs. And so what you're talking about now is a rulemaking that will attempt to address that issue on the front end, or more during the life of the well, but you're still going to have the issue of how do you enforce it, how do you collect it, what happens if the operator can't pay. And so I guess you can't answer that today, but it's obviously a pretty important piece of this.
Ms. Murphy?
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner Boygan, I think those are, it's an encapsulation of a lot of important concepts, and I think kind of tying back to the Stoger recommendations, identify a couple of questions that this commission may wrestle with if it so chooses in a future rulemaking around financial assurance for idle wells. And I'm going to use idle wells just because we're talking about the idle well report here. And complementary to the recommendations in the Stoger report around idle well financial assurance, idle well fees, what the Stoger report identifies what a couple of other states are doing or have done on this front that may be helpful. Complementary to that, Senate Bill 19-181 specifically directs this commission to take up a financial assurance rulemaking and consider the work that stakeholders put in last calendar year on financial assurance, to look at the commission's bond financial assurance program, other ways it could be improved, revised, et cetera. And so I think that those two pieces together, or those three pieces really, Senate Bill 19-181, the Stoger report, and then the financial assurance report from last December, are a good foundation for this commission to start looking at financial assurance when we get there. I don't think we're quite there yet. We've got quite a bit on our plate between now and April, and I'm staring at Jeff, making sure he's not screaming at me to stop talking and kicking me under the table saying we're going to switch paths, but it appears that I'm on safe ground in saying we're going to look at financial assurance in the future. But I think those three pieces are important. On the coming back to your question of current status today, As Diana mentioned, we are doing an annual audit of inactive well bonding to make sure we are taking a hard look at that. And those cases aren't coming to you very often, you're correct, and that's because most operators are bonding up and are meeting their obligations under this rule. I would probably defer to Ms. Larson or Secretary Larson or Jeremy Farron, who's not here, to talk about the enforcement component and how many of those actually get referred to enforcement versus worked out and the operator complying with the rules. But there is an active monitoring of inactive status and the financial assurance requirements because we recognize the risk to the state of orphan wells and operators abandoning assets.
Any more questions or comments? Thank you so much. Great presentation. So the agenda says that we're going to break for lunch and executive session, and it's a few minutes after 12, but what do you all think about diving into some of the Commissioner 181 rulemaking feedback? Does that sound good, just to use our time to the maximum? What do you think? Yeah? Okay, let's do that. So we're moving into Commissioner SB 181 rulemaking feedback. And we will still have executive session, but let's start with this and we'll see how time goes, and we want to make sure we take a break for executive session, and then we also have public comment that starts at 2:15. So we're on good track right now. We have plenty of time, I think, so just want to maximize. Ms. Larson?
Yes. Thank you. So, Chair Gibbs, would you like to have the working lunch be during executive session at 1 o'clock? And then have the SB 181 rulemaking comments from commissioners now between noon and 1?
Yeah.
Okay.
Does that sound good?
Sure.
Okay. Great. So we'll open it up. Any comments that any commissioners have regarding the rulemaking process so far? Yeah, Commissioner Hahn, you want to kick it off?
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Gibbs. So, following a conversation with staff and Director Robbins, must have been last week, I believe, we were talking about flow lines, and as he was asking about cumulative impacts and my thoughts on that. And I was sort of stopped in my tracks with the cumulative impacts question, because I'd been spending so much time on flow lines that that's kind of where my thoughts and studying had been. So I told him I would defer comment until later. And so we also discussed objective criteria in that conversation. And so in still feeling kind of a sense of frustration in terms of what we've been able to accomplish, or the enormous task still in front of us with such limited time that we meet, I started to really think about cumulative impacts and objective criteria, and came to this kind of interesting point in my thought process is where I think we need a new paradigm. And I think I would challenge all of us to start thinking of this whole permitting process from a completely different standpoint. I see this as being, the way things work now, I don't see the twos and the 2As and the objective criteria gelling very well. It feels like we have kind of two different monsters that we're trying to deal with. And so I brought this up to a friend who's in oil and gas and has been for years, and we kind of hashed this over. And I see this as maybe we start to come at the permitting process from like a business plan. And we use objective criteria and the wonderful mitigation toolbox on the website. We streamline and define what those objective criteria mean in terms of specifics to operators, and put create like a template that the operator has the onus of completing and checking off that they've paid attention to and explained how they're going to deal with everything within the objective criteria. And we talked a little bit about this could be there could be a couple of different templates based on geographic location where the drilling permits are being applied for. And it seems like an easier fit. And then the operator comes to the commission with this completed business plan, if you will. And it shows that they've worked through everything that we consider to be a priority. It makes it a more seamless operation for the staff to approve the permits. I see it as a benefit actually for the operators because they see right in front of them what they have to do, and if they check all the boxes and fill everything out, meet all the criteria, then they can feel fairly assured that they will get approved, or at least maybe with some tweaking. And I see this as having like an open, like say a 20-day open comment period where the public can comment on what's been proposed and have some direct input if they have concerns, and then the staff can review that. So I guess what I'm challenging us with is looking at this permitting process from a completely different standpoint and see if there's a way to make it jive with our new objective criteria a little more easily. And I actually meeting with somebody in oil and gas next week, and we're going to spend a lot of hours coming up with kind of a skeleton plan to then hopefully present to Director Robbins and the staff and the rest of the commission as kind of a starting point. And so I would like to hear others' thoughts on maybe switching this up a little bit.
Director Robbins?
Thank you, and thank you, Commissioner Hahn, and I appreciated having a chance to talk with you about this. I guess I would inform the commission a little bit that I think that Commissioner Hahn's ideas are a little bit in line with what I'm doing, kind of currently, and that's somewhat what we were told to do under objective criteria. So Senate Bill 181 specifically says that we're not supposed to be permitting under the our old mandate, and instead we're supposed to use objective criteria to look at permits, and if they're approved, make sure that they're more protective. I think, creating the template, maybe that's something that we should think about. I think one of the questions that had been in my head all along is, as we do mission change or, sort of mission change rulemaking, moving from fostering to regulating, how much of the approach from the bill on objective criteria, which was an interim approach, how much of that interim approach finds its way into the penultimate rulemaking? I think that's a question that we've not really gotten into yet, and that's something that certainly deserves debate from all stakeholders as we go forward and look at mission change. So I will, I think another component that we've been thinking about internally with my leadership team and staff is creating, kind of one permitting process as opposed to the 2A, the DSU, the pooling. And so we have been looking at that and sort of debating the pros and cons of that. So I'll like to hear from other commissioners at this point, but those are some initial ideas.
Great. Other commissioners? Commissioner Hopkins?
maybe I'm too maybe because of my background, I'm a little too task-focused at times, but I tend to put the permitting modifications and things more in the staff's and Director Robbins' province, because it's an administrative process at this point. And the task focus that I have is more on the rulemakings that we're supposed to do. And I've heard a lot of talk about mission change, and I've heard a lot of comments from people who come and talk to us about mission change, and they want to hear about mission change like yesterday. And so I was more focused from my perspectives. First of all, let me thank you all for putting this on the agenda. I think having an ability among the commissioners to actually have a chat about what we've been doing and what we're going to be doing, I really appreciate the fact that you all have done that and are allowing that opportunity to occur at this particular point in time. So I appreciate that. I generally am very supportive of the timelines that you've had and the way you've organized these things. But I do have some thought, and I don't, and if Commissioner Hahn, we want to continue on that process, that's fine, and talk about that. And if I'm getting out of order, I'd be happy to go back to the end of the line and talk about mission change when it's appropriate. But I would like to make a few comments since I've opened it up already on mission change. I'll continue, not hearing any objections. When I think about mission change, I think about SB 81, and I think SB 81 really defines the mission change for us in its language. It uses some very straightforward language, but it also uses some language that I think would require regulatory interpretation to really frame this whole thing up. I think this is kind of like the framing part of what we're going to be doing with all the rest of the rules that we're responsible for, or things that we're not responsible for in the future, for future commissions. So when I look at SB 81 and I look at section, I think well, I've got the bill in front of me. It's the 2.5A provision in section 12, which to me defines the heart of it. It says, in exercising the authority granted by this article, the Commission shall regulate oil and gas operations in a reasonable manner to protect and minimize adverse impacts to public health, safety, welfare, and the environment and wildlife resources, and shall protect against adverse environmental impacts on any air, water, soil, or biological resource resulting from oil and gas operations. That's a big charge in and of itself, but then there's another provision in the definition section that talks about what minimizing adverse impacts are. And that talks about to the extent necessary and reasonable to protect public health, safety, and the environment and wildlife resources, avoid adverse impacts from oil and gas operations, and minimize and mitigate the extent and severity of those impacts that cannot be avoided. To me, that sets out our mission change. That's the heart of it. And I'd like to see I'd really like to see some type of discussion and the staff come up with some ideas about how you would memorialize that, to me at least, the heart of mission change in some type of regulatory language, because there's some things that I think are straightforward. Obviously, protecting human health and the environment and safety is very straightforward. There are some things that I think are much more difficult and may require a lot of thought and process to define, such as reasonable and necessary, qualifiers for some of these things that I think are important to discuss. So that's where I'm coming from on the rulemaking, and I'd like to see that prioritized early, because I think it's going to set a lot of framework and help clarify a lot of questions that people have about what this is all about, if we can come up with a very strong statement and clear regulation about what this is really all about in our minds. And I just shared with you what it is in my mind. So that's, and I think, thank you, that's what I wanted to say.
Other commissioners, and also before we move it to other commissioners, I mean, we could always have this as kind of a standing, feedback check-in for all of our meetings. I think it might be worthwhile just to make sure we can have this opportunity to just have a free-flow conversation for a check-in. Other commissioners? Commissioner Jolan?
Yeah. Thank you, Commissioner Hahn, for kind of describing what your vision is for connecting all of the dots. And it does beg the question for me, which I have been trying to understand, is how the comprehensive drilling plan, because when you refer to a business plan, for each operator going forward. The piece that I'm trying to understand is how we connect what already exists for comprehensive drilling plans with the work that's in front of us, and is there room in that piece of it to hit what Director Robbins is currently doing with objective criteria, and then what you've outlined as kind of putting that on a, I think, maybe codified process going forward. So I appreciate your lens.
Commissioner Hahn.
Thank you. And I agree with Commissioner Hopkins that a lot of this does lie with the staff and within their scope. But I also feel like, I guess thinking of the permitting process and the way that I kind of outlined it, actually kind of re-energized me for rulemaking, because I suddenly felt like I could picture how the rules were going to be applied, and making sure that things that we all feel important are included in that template that we can create. And so I was hoping that maybe, if we can all sort of redirect our thinking a little bit, that maybe we could all feel a little re-energized and hopeful that we can really make some progress. So.
Commissioner Eaton. Commissioner Overturf.
Yeah, I would just say that I think there's actually a good deal of overlap between what you both have sort of articulated here, and I think it would be certainly possible and maybe even preferable to use the mission change rulemaking as one of the opportunities to reevaluate how the permitting process works. And I certainly could be supportive of a pathway where there's a set list of criteria or evaluations, and if an operator can show that they have met these various standards, that then there's a simplified permitting process, and if those conditions are not satisfied, then there's additional review and consideration and additional process. And so I think that's definitely something that makes sense for staff to be considering. I guess one other thing that I would just say in reaction to some of the conversation that's happened to date is that for me personally, while I have assumed, and I recognize we haven't had a conversation about this as a commission, but traditionally, I think you're correct that permitting has really been under the purview of the director, and it hasn't been something, especially when we're talking about 2s and 2As, it hasn't been something that the commission as a body has been involved in, other than if an entity, one of the enumerated entities asks for a hearing, then we conduct that hearing. I think it's important to realize that there's a sea change in how this commission is going to be operating going forward, and there will be, after we're all long gone, there will be a professional commission that will have the capacity to be more involved in those permitting decisions. And I think there's a lot of value in terms of transparency, responsiveness, to having the new professional commission be more involved in that permitting process. And so I do see part of our role in particularly the mission change rulemaking is, just as you said, establishing that framework that then the professional commission is going to pick up, start utilizing, and then also probably modify and perfect over time.
Yes, thank you, Chairman Gibbs. To the commission as a whole, that is a discussion point that we've been having with my leadership team and staff and my management team is, and one of the things that I have mentioned a couple of times as we've talked about the rulemakings, plural, is we need to be always conscious that we're creating rules for a different commission, for a professional commission, 5 members, 8 to 5, whatever it is, 5 days a week, et cetera. And so their capacity, their bandwidth is going to be, tremendous compared to your bandwidth, and you're doing a phenomenal job. Thank you very much. And so we've been thinking along the lines of, what are the pro cons of moving permitting from the director to the professional commission? They could meet weekly, frankly, and likely will. So we've been having that discussion. I appreciate that you daylighted that as a good point to be thinking about, and I encourage the commission to continue to think along those lines, because that is where we're going to be pretty soon.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, and I appreciate Commissioner Overturf and Director Robbins. Kind of clarifying that thought process, because that was similar along the lines as far as where my mind was going with it. I think Commissioner Hahn, to respond to your concept, what I'm hearing is really a performance-based regulatory process, and I actually do think that SB 181 anticipates a performance-based regulatory process. You see it in land use processes. Some land use processes are Euclidean zone. Some land use processes are more performance-based. I do think that the utilization of the objective criteria does create a performance-based approach currently. It may be not as streamlined as what you would like to see. I think through rulemaking, it has the opportunity to, take some of these different processes through Form 2s and 2As and, the different processes we have, and perhaps create a little more, packaged approach to the performance-based regulatory process. But I do think that that's an intelligent way of, looking at permitting this type of stuff. In addition, I think it's interesting, having just been on this commission for a few months now, that there is no ultimate check and balance of the permitting process through the commission, and I do think that that's something that is a professional commission that is essential, because you see it at local government level, where you've got a land use process, you've got a planning commission, you've got different determinations, you've got planning staff, you've got different determinations of how different land use permits go through, but ultimately there is a check and balance there, and an appeal. There's an appeal process here, but just a final review doesn't mean that everything has to go in front of the planning commission or the oil and gas commission for every single application. But at some point, there's a quick review that gives a final stamp of approval of the commission, particularly on what I would call major impacts, versus more administrative review type of situation. So I think that these are things that a professional commission really has that opportunity to put the time in order to be able to address that, because if you look at the volume of permits that go through the Oil and Gas Commission, that's going to be difficult even for a professional commission to be able to address on an individual basis.
Commissioner Eaton.
Thank you, and I also want to thank the director and everyone for providing this time, and for Commissioner Hahn for getting us going on having this conversation, because I think it's very important. And just following up on what Commissioner Messner said, I think that the other issue that we're wanting to build in here is how the public can participate in these processes, and who, the checks and balances is partly, we're not seeing it because certain parties don't have the opportunity to bring certain issues to the commission. So I think, there are a whole lot of things that I think we're going to need to look at as part of the mission change rulemaking, and really think about how that process, how the processes all fit together. And I don't know how prescriptive, we need to be in terms of the streamlining, because I do think that there's some of that goes to the staff, but really laying out what the criteria and the process is going to be for how we, how permits are developed and then how they're approved, I think is going to, it's very important.
Anything else? Yeah. Commissioner Hopkins.
I think there's a lot of merit to going down this path, but I've got one caution that occurred to me as I was listening to the conversation, is that the commission process follows at the very end, in my mind, of a local government process that starts first. And I want to provide the flexibility and authorities to the local governments to do their job, because they know their residents better than the state knows their residents in that particular jurisdiction. And so what I liked about SB 181 was that it said, and what I liked the way I think the director emphasized as well, is that there's not going to be any COGC activity on those permits, like a 2A or a 2, I guess, but I'll use 2A because 2A is much closer to my home in terms of being surface impacts, until the local jurisdiction has disposed of, I don't remember the right word, but it's disposed of that permit, or they've reached their resolution, or they haven't reached their resolution, and it's over, but so it's now the commission's role. So to me, that doesn't necessarily lend itself well to the streamlining approach, because I think that local governments are going to do all that streamlining and have all that done. And then I view the COGC as kind of like the administrative okay. And, or if something is really wrong, the check on it. But I think all those things would be worked out in terms of expectations of what the operator needs to do and how they're going to do it with the increased local government authority. And it's not preempted anymore, and they can be more stringent. So that's something that I think complicates the simple model. I'm receptive. I like the idea of making it simple and laying out the expectations for the operators ahead of time, but I think at the local level, those expectations are going to be laid out by the communities and the governments that represent them. So that's my thought on how to, just a caution, I guess, on that.
Commissioner Messner.
Well, I appreciate that thought, and I do think that it's accurate that there will have to be a local government review or land use process for those local governments that choose to have that process. I can tell you that there's a significant number of local governments that currently are going to choose to not. And in that case, then this becomes the de facto land use regulatory process, you know, in lieu of that local government choosing not to have that process.
Commissioner Hopkins.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I appreciate that it's very different in different areas. Different local governments have different capabilities. And so I'm not saying that the commission shouldn't develop that. If it's going to develop a process to take care of that kind of particular situation, which I think it should, obviously, that may be the right process for that. But I don't think it should preempt the other possible process for the local governments that can do that. And I'm sure when the more you get into a residential area with more, more populated areas, you're going to have expectations from the residents that the local government will protect them, and so I think that's the role they should play. So I believe me, I take the caution, and I appreciate it, but I think there's a way to work through that.
Again, then Commissioner Eaton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't want to prolong this discussion because we're going to have a lot of opportunity to debate these issues. My concern, frankly, is I don't want to see us create a system that is so focused on overwhelming process that we significantly cripple the ability of industry to continue to operate in a viable and economic manner. And I know that is provocative to some people to hear a statement like that, but I think we have to remember that we're dealing with an important industry in the state that requires a certain amount of certainty and predictability in its planning in order to function, and that wells are drilled all over the state in lots of different areas under lots of different circumstances, and process in one area, perhaps in and around a community in the Front Range, isn't necessarily going to be the same type of process that works